Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Manu Sharma, partner FOI, a geopolitical risk advisory, a person who has spent a long time studying the big trends in economics, geopolitics, and financial markets. Welcome, Manu.
It's good to be here, Atul.
Thank you for your time, Manu. Manu, today we are discussing the historic intervention of the US Treasury to save the yen. Let me give some background for our viewers and listeners. On Friday, 31st of July, July 31st, the US Treasury intervened in yen exchange rates. This is the first time Tokyo and Washington have joined forces to support the yen by outright purchases in nearly 30 years. So what was the mechanics? The Federal Reserve Bank of New York conducted a sale of euros to buy yen on behalf of the US Treasury. This is a story broken by the financial. These sales occurred through Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. The Treasury had told several banks on Wall Street that it would intervene to support the yen. The yen is the Japanese currency, because on July 23rd, which is 8 days before July 31st, which is Thursday, a week before Thursday, the yen hit its weakest level against the dollar since 1986. Now, because of the intervention, the yen strengthened, the dollar weakened a little bit, and importantly, the Treasury's intervention to bolster the yen is the first since 1998. I'll repeat, the first since 1998. And that year, the US Treasury bought the yen to support the Japanese economy, to strengthen the Japanese economy after the yen had dropped to 8 years low. Now, the US Treasury also intervened in Japan's currency in 2011, but this time it was to weaken it, and it was part of a coordinated international effort to prevent currency appreciation. This was after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. I will stop. I won't bury our viewers, our listeners in detail. Why is all this important, Manu?
Okay.
Paint us a picture of, yes, all of this happened, but why does it matter? Please.
Yeah, indeed. So the first thing to understand, if one has to analyze this particular operation by the US Fed, is that Japan, and by that I mean the Bank of Japan and the economy of Japan, is a net capital provider to rest of the world. Now, what does that mean? So basically, after the World War II, Japan was the biggest success story in terms of industrialization on Earth. And as a result, they accumulated some of the biggest capital surpluses from their international trade over the decades that followed. So what that meant was that by the 90s, the Japanese basically were the financiers of all kinds of industrialization efforts, which were largely in Asia, and the financialization efforts, which were taking place in what we may call the wider West, the G7, or maybe the OECD. So understand it here that the industrialization was being promoted in the Asian setup, in the Asian countries or developing countries, and financialization was being carried out in the wider West. So what does the current scenario mean for that? So a weaker yen, whenever yen gets weaker beyond a point, the Bank of Japan has to step in to save the domestic population from the inflation that follows from a weak yen. And also, it has to stabilize the financial flows within the wider system. Now, why do they have to do it? Like, one may ask, why is yen so systemically important? Because the Bank of Japan, when they had accumulated those capital surpluses, maintained a very low interest rate regime, which means that they used to hand out soft loans, that is, lend out money at incredibly low rates. So the rest of the world, what it did was they would borrow from Japan in yen and then purchase some other currency. So if you were an American, you would go borrow in yen, come back and buy US stocks or US bonds. And then some other fellow, let us say in Vietnam, would go and borrow in yen and would establish a factory of Nike or some other component of electronic that they would export. So here's the deal, that Japan is the net provider of capital for both industrialization and financialization. And if Japan faces a headwind whereby their macro indicators come under stress, then it kind of becomes a global problem. It becomes the world problem. And that's where US stepped in to stabilize the system, and they said, fine, we will help Japan because they are systemically important. They're important to us, and they're also important to the wider world. And it's kind of our duty to keep the global financial stability, range bound. We should not have too many of black swans out there. But here is the problem.
So
the problem
very quickly, if I can stop you.
So let me just make one point, before we break. That the real message of this intervention was in how this was conducted. So yes, there's a fact that the intervention was conducted, but the mechanics of the intervention also reveal a lot, and we shall discuss that later in this talk.
So, Manu, would it be fair to say that you were describing the yen carry trade?
Yes, I was describing the yen carry trade. So
can I very quickly give a summary before we carry
on? Indeed.
So the yen carry trade, for those of you who are new to markets and economics, this is a 101, as they say in the US, a very quick introduction. What it involves is that you borrow money in a currency with low interest rates, and then you use that to buy higher yielding assets. It could be denominated in another currency. There was a joke at one point that Japanese housewives would borrow yen and then buy Kiwi bonds, meaning New Zealand bonds. That was when I was beginning life in the city of London. And the mechanics works this way. Is, let's say you're an investor. Let's say Manu decides he wants to invest in, say, gold, or say pharmaceutical stocks, doesn't matter which assets, or farmland with water. He goes and he says, okay, I'll take 10 million yen from Japan. Then what he does is he converts the yen. If he wants to buy gold, he just buys gold. If he wants to buy farmland somewhere in the currency where the farmland is available, if it's pharmaceuticals, maybe rupees, doesn't matter. But the point is you exchange the yen for another currency. Then, of course, he invests that, okay? Often the Japanese were investing in US treasuries, or often, global equities as well. And then what happens is that the investor pockets the yield differential, the spread between the returns in the higher currency and, the low borrowing cost of the yen. Now, often people, especially financial institutions, use heavy leverage, which is what private equity does, which is sometimes what hedge funds do, which means if you buy this glass of water for $1 and then you sell it for $1.10, you make a 10% return. But if you buy this glass of dollar for, let's say, the same price, but 90% of it, 90 cents of it is borrowed, and then you sell it for 110 cents, and let's assume you give zero interest rates, you've just made 100% profit instead of 10% profit. Over to you, Manu. Would that be fair? Have I got it right? Do I get a pass mark in explaining yen carry trade?
Yes, indeed. Just to substantiate what you said. So yen carry trade in two lines is basically you borrow in Japan and you buy in some other country, third country.
Yeah.
And the reverse of that would be called unwinding of the carry trade. Now, that's a very dangerous thing.
The unwind risk, as they often used to teach us in finance classes.
because hidden in this carry trade is the risk of Japan needing that money which they've lent out back in case of some kind of economic duress. And what we've observed right now, in I think first time in about 40 years, that yen has hit a low, which means basically that the currency has depreciated, which means that the imports for Japan for consumption of their domestic population, the inflation is rising because of that. The imports are getting expensive. Second aspect,
very quickly, Ueda, just a second. Let me look for his position. Kazuo Ueda, who is the Bank of Japan governor. Kazuo Ueda said that inflation was approaching 2%. Now, that may not sound a lot to somebody in, say, Pakistan or Kenya, but it is a big deal in Japan, which suffered deflation after the stock market collapsed in the early 90s. We've covered this in our podcast. Glenn and I have a long podcast on Japan. We cover a lot there. And those of you who want a deeper dive over a long historical period, listen to it. But the important thing is underlying inflation is, according to Kazuo Ueda, the governor of the Bank of Japan, it is approaching the 2% stability target. And therefore, they have to pay attention, in his words, to upside risks to inflation. Over to you, Manu.
Yeah. So inflation is one element. The other element is that the institutions within Japan, may run out of capital for their needs. So, for example, the banking sector within Japan can become capital deficient because most of the capital, if it gets deployed outside, and at the same time, their currency is increasingly going down, then there comes a time whereby the Japanese institutions will be forced to say, okay, we need to maybe borrow money or maybe unwind some of our investments. And this is where, things start to get serious for rest of the world and also for Japan. So that's basically the chessboard, as we may say, as it existed.
So, Manu, if I can add, there are two things going on. One is a supply side shock because Japan imports its fuel, oil and gas. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Bab el-Mandeb is also partially blocked, if not completely blocked. And Japan does not, to my knowledge, import much Russian oil or Russian gas. So the massive supply side shock means that obviously they are paying more for all this oil. And if the yen drops, they are paying in dollars. So they are paying more. So they are short of capital. And even though there is an inflationary pressure, the Bank of Japan on Friday, which is 31st July, if I'm getting my dates right, the Bank of Japan held interest rates at 1%. They did not increase interest rates. So if you have inflation, the best way to combat it is to obviously increase interest rates. That sucks money out of the economy. But Bank of Japan's costs are going up. Import bill is going up because of the supply side shock. But they have declined to increase interest rates because they want to stimulate activity within their own economy. Their new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, is running an expansionary fiscal policy. The government debt has probably reached 250% of the GDP. And so because they want to stimulate economic activity, inflationary pressures threaten to take off. And of course, they don't have, as Manu said, enough capital at home. Institutions are running out of money. And therefore, the intervention of the US Treasury became important, And note that this came at a time when Kazuo Ueda has faced criticism from investors over his failure to raise rates more quickly. Some have even warned that the Bank of Japan risks losing credibility. Over to you, Manu.
So, as Atul has talked about, the underlying conditions which triggered this kind of an intervention, there are two key takeaways for most of, I would say, viewers, listeners, and interested parties. That first, despite this intervention, which is a massive thing, it's once in, like, so the last time it occurred was in 1998, in the immediate aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, which was also triggered by currency movements, but that was largely limited to Southeast Asia. But somehow some contagion was apparent in the Japanese markets, and some bailout was needed. But the key thing here is that the underlying conditions that triggered the current intervention, they have not gone away. So yes, the intervention is massive, it's major, it's unprecedented in the recent times. It hasn't happened in this century, at least. The last time it happened was in 1998, the previous century. So this is big, but the underlying conditions haven't eased out. So number one. The second takeaway is that whenever you buy something, so how do you defend a currency? It's not like a military thing, whereby you take guns and tanks to save a currency. You go and sell some other currency to buy the currency that you're trying to save, which basically means you generate an artificial demand for the currency that is facing selling pressure and ease that selling pressure by boosting artificial demand. That's what the Fed and the Bank of Japan jointly did. Now, Bank of Japan obviously sold dollars because they were holding dollars to generate artificial demand for yen and boost their currency up. But what did the US Fed sell? They sold euros. Now one might say, okay, fine, you can sell this or that, what difference does it make? But there is a very subtle geopolitical signal here for anyone that wants to decipher, and that is that when it comes to, two very staunch allies of the United States of America, which is either the EU or Japan, I think the choice has been made as to who is more favored amongst the two. And that party, I guess, is Japan. So if, by some other reason, let us say the underlying conditions don't ease off and there is an economic crisis, a global contagion of sorts, in which both EU, Japan, and you can even put in Korea and maybe Singapore, and and obviously the Middle East is already, the Gulf countries are already under stress, then the priority, I think, of the US Treasury and the current administration is quite clear, and that is Japan. So Japan will be the first to be rescued. So, as they say in a sinking ship or a boat, ladies and children first, so there is always a hierarchy of who is to be saved.
Sanae Takaichi is a lady. Obviously, she comes first.
Yeah, that's Providence. Yeah,
true. It's funny. A senior person in Washington, D.C., decision-making circles joked, and he said that Obama came up with the term Asia pivot, but actually Donald Trump has executed it.
I think from the mere point of view of the prioritization, the last time Japan was systemically important, and there was some wrangling around its status, was back in the days of Plaza Accords, when the wider
West, to the 80s. We have to go back to the 80s, my friend.
Yes. Yeah. And back then, the negotiation was around the level of industrialization that Japan could potentially aspire for, and whether they had to cap their ambitions or not. And they indeed capped their ambitions to keep the alliance going.
So very quickly, our viewers would not know the Plaza Accord. Plaza Accord
you can explain
occurs
them.
is
You can explain it.
in 1905, and it is not just Japan. In those days, Germany was West and East Germany. The Soviet Union was still around till 1991. So France, West Germany, Japan, and the UK agreed to depreciate the US dollar and basically appreciate their own currencies. And the reason to do so, as Manu pointed out, was to ensure that they would not retain an edge in their industries. And because with a cheaper currency, their industrial goods were cheaper and were outcompeting the US. And the goal was to ensure that the deindustrialization of the US would not continue at the same pace. And it is something that has shaped the consciousness of Donald Trump, Scott Bessent, and the entire Trump administration. They have long wanted to do a modern version of the Plaza Accord. Over to you, Manu.
To put it in context, had the Plaza Accord not taken place, and I'm now completely removing America out of the picture and making this as only a Europe-Japan kind of thing, Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW would have been history, perhaps. Yeah, I think the Germans like to call it BMW.
Yeah, that is true.
So just trying to adhere to how it's spoken. But
Bayern Motor Works.
Yes. Now the thing is that the much famed German automobile industry would have faced significant setback back in the 80s itself if Plaza Accord was not undertaken. So back then what happened? America prioritized, or at least kept, the Europeans on an even keel. They kept them on an even keel while negotiating the Plaza Accords. But now, I think if this is indeed what the establishment thinks in America, and it's been years since I left DC, so I don't know much as to what's the zeitgeist now. But if this is indicative of what's to follow, then I think the choice has been made. It will be Japan over the EU, and EU will have to now think for itself.
And so, interestingly, they prefer Japan over the EU. So some would say, oh, this is because of China. But the other argument one hears is that they are the US administration, or the Trump administration, and any US administration, doesn't matter who's in charge, is scared of Japan dumping US assets to save the yen, because that could trigger a contagion. Manu, where do you stand here?
See, the risk of contagion is definitely there, and there are no two doubts about it. And that is why we've seen an intervention. The question again is the mechanics of the intervention. So fine, we understand that yen will be saved because it's obligatory, it's important, it's imperative. But what do you sell to save the yen? Now, what the American establishment would have signaled, because again, $5 to $10 billion worth of euros, I think, or 5 or 10 billion euros perhaps is not a big amount for the Treasury, in terms of the dent it would cause to the national finances. But symbolically, it's a big deal, because the Treasury could have very well said, you know what, the EU is part of the wider Western alliance, so fine, we'll take one for the team. 5 to 10 billion or $12 billion is nothing much for us. We'll sell that to save yen. No, they said we'll sell euro from our portfolio. So I think the symbolic act of specifically selling euros, even if in a small quantity, I think it is something most European friends of ours would obviously deny and object to it and say, and would come about with a rather long-winded explanation for why this thing happened. But my sense is that this is a clear-cut indication. The read from Asia is that Japan is systemically important for the Americans, and they will go all out to save that economy, that country. So Japan, it has somewhere become the I would say, the UK of Asia, if one may call
special
it,
relationship.
as of now. Yes,
So,
it's
so,
indeed
so,
a special relationship.
so Manu, the mainstream Europeans may deny this, but our European friends are odd. They are not mainstream, as you very well know. So the read from our friends in finance, especially German friends in finance, was that the US has clearly signaled that it is willing to throw Europe under the bus. And their read is a very realpolitik read. They think that the US sees the EU as an economic rival. The US has decided not necessarily to destroy the EU, but certainly to subordinate the EU to its will. And the read from the geopolitically aware finance people in London, in Frankfurt, in Zurich, and other financial centers, including Amsterdam, is that this happened at Europe got hit by a double whammy. Ceuta, the immigrant invasion in Ceuta, where 60,000 people stormed into Spanish territory, the Spanish holdout on African soil, and 67 died. The numbers may be different. Maybe the numbers are dated, whilst I may be a little behind, but it's big numbers. These are significant numbers. So the immigrant invasion, combined with the sale of euros, demonstrates that the EU does not command affection in Washington, D.C. circles. Coordination between Brussels, the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve will be exceedingly difficult. The Europeans also think that the Trump administration has an ideological vendetta against the Europeans. They see the European social welfare model as inspiration for the Democrats. And therefore, they want to, A, make sure that they come up trumps against the Europe in economic competition, and B, they want to put pressure on the social welfare model so that the Europeans become more like the Americans, and the Democrats cannot point at the shining city on the hill as an exemplar for America. So there's a lot going on, wheels within wheels. And to be fair, the Europeans are not entirely misreading the situation, because in Republican circles, again and again, I pick up a sense of impatience, if not anger, against European moralizing against America. And there is this sense that we have subsidized European security, so the Europeans should not behave in a high-handed, moralizing manner with us. So over to you, Manu. This is the feedback I'm getting.
Indeed. And, I'm like, I've never been very popular with the European friends, but I like to put it this way, often the simpler explanations are better. So what's currently happening is that the American establishment realizes that Japan, at the end of the day, is a net supplier of capital in a world whereby, capital can be exceedingly deficient, whereas Europe is a net supplier of moral lectures. And between the two things, you can easily find what's more valuable, and accordingly, that's being prioritized. And it's not really, one may say, oh yeah, fine, that the Trump administration is maybe ideologically hostile. Well, it could be, but then if it were some other administration, what would they do? That's my question. Would they not save Japan? I don't think so. Even the most left of the center president would have been forced to undertake similar maneuvers. Maybe not sell euros, but they would have saved Japan. And I think that is the baseline. Europe is ignoring Draghi Commission report to its own peril. It's not listening to its well-wishers. And I think the messaging is accordingly out.
So what are the implications? Some say that the EU itself could be under threat because of both economic pressures and immigration pressures. Look, countries suspended the Schengen visa arrangement with Spain after the Ceuta immigrant invasion. So do some crystal ball gazing and tell us what lies ahead. And not just for Europe, but also for Japan and the US, because the KOSPI fell 30%. We've put a post on LinkedIn. Those of you who do not follow FOI, make sure you go and follow us. Follow FOI on LinkedIn. I'm a partner there, full disclosure. I'm a colleague of Manu's. I'm also, as you know, the founder of Fair Observer. The key thing is that with the fall of KOSPI, in the same week, the intervention to prop up the yen, there's a bubbling fear among seasoned investors that we are on the verge of a meltdown and there is real risk of contagion. So please do some crystal ball gazing, Manu.
Okay, so first thing to understand for most of, I would say, participants and maybe non-participants in the current economies is that we are indeed living in a very frothy phase of global economy, whereby the fundamentals are detached from the reality, and not merely detached, like one can say, okay, yeah, often you have cyclical patterns of things running ahead of the fundamentals. What we are currently witnessing is a systemic shift or a regime shift, whereby the entire resource and security architecture across the world is getting reoriented. I'll repeat, the entire resource and security architecture across the globe is getting reoriented. You have two major...
Manu, if I can stop you and plug our FOI Geopolitical Risk Monitor, we wrote about this in great detail. And those of you who want access to it, just reach out to us. We'll send you the link. We've covered this whole change in the resource architecture, the financial architecture, and the security architecture in our Geopolitical Risk Monitor of May, the Hormuz shock, as we call it, but it's much greater than that. Over to you, Manu.
Yeah. So in terms of crystal ball gazing, what we are observing is that the traditional resource and capital flow pipelines are getting reorganized. I'm not calling it a disruption yet, but reorganized. And because of that, you are witnessing some industries and economies by implication become uncompetitive and others becoming more competitive. A good example is look at electric vehicles being made in China. 10 years ago, they were not really on the picture. They were okay. And today they're absolutely dominating the show.
People are calling it the second China shock, by the way. That's the term a lot of economists and market observers are using.
And the second, I would list a contrary point is what's happening to the automotive industry and also the chemicals industry in Germany. These are two industries which have faced significant setbacks because of the war with Ukraine, because of the Hormuz imbroglio, and also the fact that geopolitically they are unable to find a sweet spot in this new realigned world. So all in all, what we are witnessing is that the engines of economic growth within the EU are sputtering, number one. Number two, Draghi Commission, I again go back to it, has already highlighted capital deficiency in the economy.
Again, we read it and we reported on it in a Geopolitical Risk Monitor. I personally read it cover to cover. We read it as soon as it came out, all of us. And we found it actually very well written. It's a brilliantly written report.
Yeah. So growth engine sputtering, capital deficiency, it's been admitted by Draghi and nobody seems to be working on it. And third is a very broken way of engaging with the rest of the world. So you were talking about the Schengen visa and the Schengen visa treaty and whatnot. Currently, if
I've been a victim of it. I've had friends invite me to weddings, and the way the visa authorities have behaved when I had an Indian passport was juvenile.
Yes. And that's one aspect. One may say, okay, fine, they are free to do what they want to, but
Sure.
the point is that a small or a mid-size capital investor from India would not even bother looking at the Schengen zone. And they would straight away go to either UAE, they would go to Singapore, they would go to Mauritius, they would go to even US. There are a lot of people who are using the investment visa pipeline to the US too. So,
Yes.
and so what that tells you is that there is a pool of capital that really wants to come, wants to contribute, add to the economy. But again, how you deal with one aspect of things is generally how you deal with others. So when the Americans hear empty moral lectures from Brussels or wherever the capital of that entity is, it's quite similar to what Indians hear. It's quite similar to what the Chinese get to hear and the rest of the world. And what we hear are just moral lectures. There's no business to be done, frankly. And that is why what sputtering growth engine with deficient capital and a very broken way of dealing with the world, the EU is staring at some serious geo-economic and geopolitical crisis in the next few months itself.
So there are huge structural problems within the EU, and the EU is far too rigid to address them, whether it is immigration, whether it is business. And at the same time, the Republican complaint that you hear sanctimonious moralizing is something that resonates elsewhere in the world too.
Across the world.
Across the world. All right. Manu Sharma, so much so for Europe. What about, you haven't addressed the meltdown and contagion point I asked.
Okay. So the meltdown and the contagion point is, it's basically, the proverbial gorilla in the room.
800 pound.
Or elephant, depending upon. What we are witnessing now is that the froth in the system that got generated after COVID. So the monetarists in charge, the monetary theory economists in charge of the major economies in the world suggested that the only way out from the COVID-induced shock to most of the economies was to print. And
just very quickly, our viewers and listeners should know what is MMT that you're referring to, modern monetary theory. Well, it was an alternative framework, a macroeconomic framework, which said that, sovereign governments issuing their own fiat currencies face no financial constraints. That means they cannot go bankrupt. They do not have to rely on taxes or borrowing to fund spending. Instead, they can just print money and everything will be fine. They can use that money to make ports, to build bridges. The cost of money was cheap. It was really popular for a while. Of course, as an economist who was the senior most economist in the US Treasury, our very dear friend, a great friend of Fair Observer, put it not so politely. He thought it was a whole bunch of hooey. And he said inflation will rear its ugly head sooner or later. And then all of these MMT cult members will be crawling into a dark cave.
The denouement is still pending, I would say. But yes, indeed, that kind of summarizes the structural problem that the global economy faces today. There's just too much money in the system, but there is no commensurate increase in output or value generation. So what you see is inflation. That is, asset prices are blowing up, but you don't see GDP growth blowing up across the world. Instead, what we see are trade wars. We see a mercantilist world whereby everybody's trying to snatch whatever smash and grab the other thing that we said, whatever they can, whatever industry they can reshore, bring back, stop imports. Every country is trying in its own way. Some are doing it openly, others are doing it slightly, in a more, I would say, elegant manner. But that essentially is the policy being followed by most big economies. That is, beggar thy neighbor. That global economy is a
So
zero sum game.
basically, Russia takes over 20% of Ukraine. Israel takes over territory till the Litani River. The US takes over Venezuelan oil, Greenland, and whatever
Canada.
else it wants. Canada. Oh, dearie me.
Yeah.
Oh, dearie me.
That would be something. Okay. Yeah. Right.
And Pakistan takes over the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan, perhaps, or vice versa.
That would be
God
a
help us
crisis.
all.
Okay. Yeah. True. So, so this is, a phase of the global economy, and that tells you that what's going to happen next. That the froth in the system has to settle down, and someone has to pay the bills.
So very quickly, let me stop you. Because there is so much fraud, because governments have spent like drunken sailors, and central banks have printed money like there's no tomorrow. There's too much money chasing too few assets. The debts are too high. The valuations are nuts. And so if you are sitting in a capital and you have gunboats, why wouldn't you use gunboat diplomacy? Because after all, it's worked in the past. So, hey ho, there we go. There are only three ways out. We, use inflation to deflate away the debt. So deflate the debt.
Yes.
That's option one. Number two, default, which works. But if you need more debt, you have a problem, as Argentina has demonstrated repeatedly.
Exactly. And Chile too at times.
Yeah. If you default on your debt, it's to your own peril. It went from being one of the top 10 richest countries into the world to being a basket case. And the poor souls have even lost the World Cup now.
That was hard.
Well deserved. They played like animals, in the words of a former British manager of 1966, Sir Alf Ramsey, if I remember the name correctly. And third, on a serious note, is smash, which all the empire, and in fact, it did work out quite well for the Spaniards in the short run, at least, when they took over the silver mines of South America. So, if you take over the oil of Venezuela, at least there's some relief.
Yeah. So that's why, the smash and grab strategy of appropriating whatever resource you can, it adds to your national GDP, it adds to your output, and provides some relief from inflation. Because what you have is the output catches up to the money supply already gushing around in the system. But what it also does is that it reduces the output of somebody else, right? So that's why
tough luck. They should have done their push-ups.
Exactly. So it's a beggar thy neighbor policy, and it's come back after 100 plus years or something. But this is a very
Manu, if I may stop you, you're being extremely disrespectful to Elon Musk. In an interview with The Economist, he talked about an age of superabundance. There will be AI, there will be robots, and money won't matter. Stuff will be there for the cheap. The Treasury will print checks and send it to everyone. I mean, come on. Surely you can't be going against the great entrepreneur of our age. He is the oracle of our era.
See, before Musk, it was Keynes who wrote a very nice essay about this, and he said that there will come a time where nobody would work and everybody would get checks.
You're a Cambridge man. You're biased. You're propping up John Maynard because you're a Cambridge man.
So he's
your loyalty.
I do. So he's kind of recycling that logic and trying to reframe it and present it in a AI world. But the fundamental issue with that is that when you say that everybody will sit around and get paid,
sing kumbaya,
get checked, Uh, you know, there are a lot of assumptions that get built in as to, what institution would perhaps write the checks, who would be the central aggregator of all the output and value generated in an economy. What currency would actually that currency look like? Or you may call it something else, but fundamentally it would be a currency. Uh, then there is the other question of what
It'll be
happens
Trump
to.
coin. It'll be Trump coin, surely.
Fair
Crypto.
enough. I'm happy as long as I'm getting it for not working. You can call it that. And the final question is what happens to the question of inequality, because remember what Musk is saying is flirting within nanometers of what communism says and Marx says. So we are actually getting quite close to the red logic, and it's
by the way,
very
communists
interesting.
liked engineers as leaders, and Silicon Valley also has engineers ruling the roost. What a strange coincidence.
What a strange coincidence.
All right.
And that's
Please,
please. That's why I would recommend to read the essay by Keynes called "The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." It's pretty much what Musk is saying today, and that guy wrote it back, I think, in the 1920s or 30s, and it hasn't fructified, and there are some solid practical reasons behind it, and they tend to evolve from what we are as humans, our emotions, our biases, our thinking, our preferences, and it's not that simple. You cannot mechanize the entire human society.
All right. Let me take you back to the point you made, smash and grab. Let's assume there's smash and grab. Even so, that may not stop meltdown and contagion, because the money supply has outstripped output.
Yes.
And at some point, a correction is overdue. And the AI miracle that Elon Musk paints, that output will miraculously catch up with money supply and everything will be all right and we'll sing kumbaya, is yet another, to my mind, hype like the tulip bubble of the Netherlands. This is much bubble territory as far as I'm concerned.
In economics and finance, I've observed one axiom that is held, that if it sounds too good to be true, it generally is that. So when you have promises being made which sell you the moon, I would say don't buy them. And this has happened in human history time and again.
All right, Manu Sharma, we've come to the end of our discussion. If I have your permission, maybe I should end with good old William Shakespeare. And if you remember, which I'm sure you do, Macbeth, which is a play you and I like a lot. And in Macbeth, if I remember correctly, Act 1, Scene 4, the witches say, double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
And there is a superstition around it. You never named this play.
Yes.
The Scottish play.
The Scottish play.
Never named it.
Yes.
So for the global economy, it's not a good omen.
On that Nostradamus note, we have a new Doctor Doom. Move over, Nouriel Rubini. A new kid is in town. Manu Sharma, you heard it here first. We'll see you on. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you follow FOI on LinkedIn. Make sure you write to us. Tell us what we should be examining. And we will be back to make sense of the world. Thank you, Manu Sharma, for your time.
Pleasure.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.